99 nannies couldn't get close to the Mafia boss's son. Then a child psychologist walked in, and the boy who hadn't spoken in months looked up for the very first time. What she didn't know, the little boy wasn't broken. He was waiting for someone brave enough to find the truth hidden behind his silence. The woman lasted 11 minutes. That was actually a record. Victor Kane stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 53rd floor penthouse, Manhattan sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd personally broken and rebuilt, and watched the elevator doors swallow yet another sobbing nanny whole. Her blazer was torn at the shoulder. There was a scratch running down her left forearm, thin and red like a signature. Daniel's signature. "That's 99. Said Reeves, Victor's head of security, appearing silently at his elbow the way only men trained to be invisible could. He held a leather-bound ledger, actual paper, because Victor trusted nothing digital inside these walls, and his expression carried the specific blankness of a man who had learned never to react to anything his employer did or said. "I can count, Reeves." "Of course, sir." Victor didn't turn from the window. Below, yellow cabs crawled through the gray afternoon like insects. Somewhere in this city, men feared his name. Senators returned his calls within the hour. 3 sitting judges owed him favors they'd never be able to repay. He had dismantled rival organizations the way other men dismantled furniture, methodically, quietly, leaving no usable pieces behind. He could not manage one 7-year-old boy. "Where is he now?" "His room, sir. He's—" Reeves paused, which was unusual. "He's drawing again." Victor finally turned. "Get me Dr. Reed. Tonight." Doctor. Sophia Reed arrived at 9 p.m., which told Victor 2 things immediately. She wasn't intimidated by the hour, and she wasn't intimidated by the address. Most people, when they learned who lived here, found reasons to reschedule. Sophia Reed had asked only one question when his assistant called. How long has the behavior been going on? Not, who is your employer, or what's the security situation, or even, how much does it pay? She'd asked about the child first. Victor noticed that. She was younger than he expected. Early 30s, dark hair pulled back practically, wearing a gray coat that had seen better days. No jewelry except small stud earrings. She carried a weathered leather bag over one shoulder and looked at his penthouse the way people looked at airports. Functional spaces, not impressive ones. "Mr. Kane," she shook his hand once, firmly. "Before we talk about Daniel, I need you to understand something. I'm a psychologist, not a nanny. If you're looking for someone to manage your son's behavior, I'm the wrong person. If you want to understand why he behaves the way he does, I'm the right one." Victor gestured toward the sitting room. "Sit down, Dr. Reed." She did. He remained standing. He told her what he knew, which was less than he was comfortable admitting. 8 months ago, Daniel had been a quiet child. Not warm, not easy, but manageable. Then one night, something shifted. No incident anyone could identify. No fall, no nightmare, no visitor that stood out. Daniel simply woke up the following morning and became someone else. Refused touch. Refused speech, mostly. Destroyed 3 rooms across 4 days. Attacked every caregiver who came within arm's reach. Doctors found nothing physically wrong. Previous psychologists, 4 of them, had offered various diagnoses. Reactive attachment disorder. Acute stress response. Childhood onset of something longer and harder to name. Each one had left within 2 weeks, citing Daniel's refusal to engage. Sophia listened without writing anything down. That, too, Victor noticed. "I'd like to see him," she said simply. "Now?" "If he's awake." Daniel was awake. He was sitting cross-legged in the center of his bedroom floor, surrounded by paper. Dozens of sheets, covered in pencil drawings, spread around him in a rough circle, like the pages of a book someone had thrown apart. The room itself was dim. Daniel had unscrewed 2 of the 3 light bulbs himself, and the staff had stopped replacing them after he'd thrown one at a housekeeper. He didn't look up when the door opened. Sophia stepped in slowly. She didn't speak. She didn't crouch down into that performative squat adults use when they're trying to appear less threatening. Daniel, Victor had found, seemed to hate that most of all. She simply stood near the doorway, with her hands visible at her sides, and looked at the drawings on the floor. Victor watched from the hall. And then the thing happened that made the hair on the back of his neck rise, though he would never have admitted that to anyone alive. Daniel looked up, not with the wild, cornered animal expression he gave everyone else. He looked up slowly, carefully, the way someone looks when they've been waiting a long time and are trying to decide if the thing they've been waiting for has finally arrived. His dark eyes moved over Sophia's face with an intelligence that didn't belong in a 7-year-old's expression. Then, and Victor almost missed it, Daniel's gaze slid sideways, past Sophia, past the doorway, down the hall, directly to where Reeves was standing. He held Reeves's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back down at his paper and picked up his pencil. Sophia turned and glanced at Victor. Her expression hadn't changed, but something behind her eyes had sharpened. She stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door almost closed behind her, leaving a gap of 2 inches, enough that Daniel could see she hadn't fully left. "He's not broken," she said quietly, so only Victor could hear. "I never said. Everyone says it without saying it." She looked back toward the narrow gap in the door. "He didn't look at me the way frightened children look at strangers, Mr. Kane. He looked at me the way someone looks when they're deciding whether they can trust you." She paused. "And then he looked at your guard." Victor said nothing. "Who is that man?" Sophia asked. "Reeves? He's been with me for 6 years, completely loyal." Sophia nodded slowly, as though storing the answer somewhere. "I'll start tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it against the wall. "And, Mr. Kane, for the sessions, I'd like fewer guards in the immediate area. Not 0, just fewer." She walked toward the elevator. Victor watched her go. Behind the almost closed door, Daniel was drawing, and for the first time in 8 months, he wasn't screaming. Sophia arrived 8 minutes early. She did this deliberately, not to impress Victor, but because she wanted to see the penthouse before it was ready for her. The version of a place that existed before guests were expected always told more truth than the version after. What she found was a household running on controlled tension. The staff moved quickly and quietly, eyes forward. Conversations dropped the moment anyone with authority entered a room. 2 guards rotated positions near the main staircase on a schedule so precise she could have set a watch by it. Everything was clean, ordered, and faintly airless, like a museum that happened to have people living inside it. A room had been prepared for the sessions on the 2nd floor. Someone had made an effort. A low table, soft chairs, a basket of art supplies in the corner. But the effort felt clinical, like a stage set designed by someone who had Googled child therapy room and followed the images exactly. Sophia moved the chairs away from the table entirely, pushed the table to the wall, and sat down on the floor. When the door opened 20 minutes later, Daniel stopped in the doorway. He was smaller than she remembered from the night before. Daylight had a way of shrinking people, especially children who'd spent months carrying enormous things. He wore a dark blue sweater, neat dark trousers. His hair was brushed. Someone loved him enough to brush his hair every morning, even when everything else was falling apart. He looked at the floor where Sophia sat, then at the chairs pushed to the sides, then at the art supplies in the basket. He walked in, sat down on the floor 3 feet away from her, and picked up a pencil. Sophia said nothing. This was the part most people got wrong. Adults, therapists included, believed silence needed to be filled. They asked questions, offered choices, narrated the room like tour guides. "Here's some paper, Daniel. Do you want to draw something? What colors do you like?" Each question a small invasion, each well-meaning word a door closing. She simply sat. She had a notebook in her lap but didn't open it. For the first 6 minutes, Daniel held the pencil without using it. He kept his eyes down, but she noticed he was tracking her breathing. His own would slow slightly when hers did, the way animals synchronize with something they're learning not to fear. It was automatic, unconscious, and it told her more than an hour of conversation would have. On the 7th minute, he began to draw. She didn't watch directly. She looked at the middle distance, letting him exist in her peripheral vision, the way you watch something wild that will startle if it feels observed. The pencil moved steadily, no hesitation, no scratching out. He knew what he was drawing before he started. After 22 minutes, he set the pencil down. He didn't show her the paper. He simply set it on the floor between them and looked at the window. Sophia waited a full minute before she looked down. The drawing was not what she expected. Children under acute stress tended toward chaos on paper. Heavy lines, dark scribbles, figures without faces or with too many features crammed into a small space. Psychologists called it graphic discharge, the visual equivalent of a scream. She had expected something like that. What Daniel had drawn was precise. A man, rendered in careful detail for a 7-year-old hand. Broad shoulders, a jacket. Not a suit, but something heavier, practical. The face was turned at 3/4 angle, enough to show a jaw, a cheekbone, and on the right hand, the hand hanging at the figure's side, a scar. Drawn with a single curved line, deliberate, starting below the knuckle of the index finger and running diagonally toward the wrist. Sophia kept her face completely still. She had learned, in 12 years of working with traumatized children, that the moment you react, the moment your expression shifts in a way the child notices, they close. Whatever door had cracked open slams shut, sometimes permanently. So, she looked at the drawing the way she would look at any drawing, her head slightly tilted, her breathing even. "Thank you," she said simply. Daniel picked up the pencil again and began drawing on a second sheet of paper. She found the scar by accident, or rather, it found her. After the session, walking back through the main hall toward the elevator, she nearly collided with a man coming from the opposite direction. Big man, dark jacket, moving with the silent ease of someone who knew exactly where every camera in this building was pointed. He stepped aside for her. She nodded a brief apology and saw his hand. Right hand. A curved scar beginning just below the index finger, running diagonally toward the wrist. Exactly as Daniel had drawn it. She kept walking. She made it to the elevator, pressed the button, stood with her back straight and her heartbeat loud in her ears. The doors closed. She looked at her own reflection in the polished steel. Who is that man? She found out within the hour. Back in her apartment, one message to a contact at a behavioral research institute who occasionally worked with federal consultants got her a name inside 3 minutes. The man had been in the background of a profile piece on Victor Kane published 2 years ago. Not named, but visible. Marcus Hale, Victor Kane's head of internal security, trusted for 11 years, the kind of man whose loyalty was spoken about in the same breath as Victor's name. She brought it up that evening, carefully, not as an accusation, not even as an observation. She framed it as a clinical detail, something she needed to understand for context. She told Victor that Daniel's drawing appeared to depict someone specific, someone he knew, and that she needed to understand the relationships in Daniel's immediate world to make progress. She described the scar. Victor's expression didn't change, not a flicker. But his stillness shifted, from the relaxed stillness of a man in control to the rigid stillness of a man choosing not to react. "That sounds like half the men in security," he said. "Occupational hazard." "Of course," Sophia said. "I just want to make sure Daniel has safe associations with the people around him, for the healing process." "Daniel is safe." Victor's voice carried a quiet finality that was designed to end conversations. "Everyone in this building has been vetted personally by me." "I don't doubt that." "Good." He picked up his phone. The meeting was over. "Same time tomorrow, Dr. Reed." She left. In the elevator going down, she opened her notebook and wrote one line. "He didn't ask me which guard." She hadn't given him a name. She hadn't given him a description beyond the scar. And Victor Kane, a man who built his empire on information, on knowing every detail before anyone else, hadn't asked a single follow-up question. He already knew exactly who she was describing. The files arrived at 7 a.m., 14 USB drives in a plain envelope, delivered by a staff member who made deliberate eye contact with the floor the entire time. Each drive was labeled with a date and a name. 99 Nannies. Victor, it turned out, had recorded every single incident. Sophia had expected this. Men like Victor Kane documented everything. Control required evidence, and evidence required records. She'd asked for the footage the previous evening, framing it as therapeutic background research. Understanding Daniel's triggers would help her build a safer environment for progress. Victor had agreed without hesitation. Now she wondered if he'd agreed too quickly. She set up her laptop at the small desk in her guest room, the room Victor had offered her when she'd accepted a temporary live-in arrangement. Better for continuity of care, she'd explained, and began watching. She started at the beginning, 14 months ago, the first documented incident. A nanny named Patricia something, late 50s, gentle-faced, who had reached out to take Daniel's hand while walking him to breakfast. Daniel had bitten her, hard enough to leave a mark. The footage was clear, the angle good, and the reaction, she noted, was instant. Zero escalation, no building agitation, no warning signs in his posture. He'd been walking calmly, and then he wasn't. She made a note, moved to the next file. By the fourth video, she'd stopped watching Daniel entirely. She was watching the background. It took until the 9th file before the pattern locked into place, and when it did, it was so clean, so precise that she actually sat back from the screen and pressed both hands flat on the desk. Daniel didn't react to strangers. He didn't react to women, or men, or loud voices, or sudden movements in isolation. Children with generalized trauma responded to categories. All men, all uniforms, all raised voices. The reaction was broad because the wound was broad. Daniel's reactions were surgical. Every aggressive incident, every scratch, every scream, every thrown object occurred in the presence of specific individuals, not random staff, not new faces. Always the same cluster of people, rotating through the background of his daily life like a crew of stagehands who didn't realize the lead actor could see them. She cross-referenced, made a list, watched 3 more files to confirm. 7 names, all male, all members of Victor's inner security circle. She recognized 2 of them from her brief time in the penthouse already, and at the top of the list, appearing in 11 of the 14 documented incidents, sometimes on camera, sometimes just audible in the corridor outside the room, was Marcus Hale. Daniel wasn't reacting to people who scared him in a general sense. He was reacting to people he specifically recognized. She documented everything in a system she developed years earlier for cases involving domestic situations, where she suspected her notes might be read by the wrong person. On the surface, the notebook read as standard clinical observation, behavioral triggers, sensory responses, emotional regulation patterns. Underneath, written in the margins in a personal shorthand she'd used since graduate school, was the real record. She worked until noon, then joined Daniel for their midday check-in. Victor had approved a loose schedule, 2 formal sessions daily, with informal access in between if Daniel permitted it. Today, he was in the library. This surprised her. The library was large, 2 stories inside the penthouse with a rolling ladder on a brass rail, the kind of room that belonged in an English countryside manor rather than a Manhattan skyscraper. Daniel was sitting on the bottom rung of the ladder, not reading, just sitting, looking at the door, like he'd been waiting for her. "Hi," Sophia said. He didn't respond, but he didn't leave either, which she was learning to read as its own form of welcome. She settled into the armchair nearest the window, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd, and opened her notebook to a blank page. For a while, neither of them did anything. Outside, the city moved. Inside, the library held its particular silence, thick and old-smelling, like silence that had been accumulating for years. Then Daniel climbed down from the ladder, crossed to the small side table where someone had placed a box of colored pencils and paper, and sat down on the rug. He drew for 40 minutes without stopping. Sophia didn't interrupt. She made soft notations in her book. His posture, his grip on the pencil, the direction his eyes moved when he paused to think. He was left-handed, she noted now. He pressed hard on the paper when drawing certain elements, lighter for others. The hard-pressed lines were always the same, always the shapes of people. When he finished, he didn't leave the drawing on the floor this time. He stood up, crossed the room, and set it on the arm of her chair. Then he walked out. The drawing was more detailed than yesterday's. A car, black, boxy, drawn from a slight above angle as though seen from a staircase or a window. The proportions were off in the way children's proportions always were, but the specific details were exact. A roof antenna, a rear spoiler, a license plate that he'd filled with random marks rather than real numbers, as if he understood that part was beyond him, but wanted her to know there was a plate. And through the passenger window, barely, in tiny, uncertain lines but unmistakably, the shape of a gun. Sophia stared at it for a long time. Outside the library door, she could hear the rotation of guards changing shift, the soft exchange of footsteps, the quiet murmur of two-word check-ins, the machinery of Victor's security, always running. She folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the back of her notebook. She found the second drawing at 11:47 p.m. She'd been asleep for less than an hour when something pulled her back to the surface. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of the particular silence she'd fallen asleep to. She lay still for a moment, cataloging the room. Nothing wrong, nothing out of place. She got up anyway. The hallway outside her room was empty and dim, night lights at ankle height throwing pale gold strips across the floor. She looked both directions. At her door, slipped beneath it, the corner sticking out into the hallway, was a sheet of paper. She picked it up. The same black car, clearer this time, more deliberate, and beside it, a figure, tall, jacket, a mark on the right hand rendered in a single curved line that required no explanation anymore. Marcus Hale, standing beside the black car, holding the gun. Sophia stood in the hallway in the dark for a very long time, the paper in her hand, listening to the penthouse breathe around her. Daniel was not having episodes. Daniel was building a case. She almost didn't find it. The file was buried, not in any dramatic sense, no encrypted folder or password-protected archive. It was buried the way truly dangerous things often are, in plain sight, mislabeled, tucked between 2 months of routine security logs like a razor blade slipped inside a book. If Sophia hadn't been looking for a specific date, she would have scrolled past it in under a second. But she was looking for a specific date. She'd spent the early hours of day 4 reconstructing a timeline. The nanny footage gave her Daniel's behavioral shift. It appeared sharply, overnight, 8 months ago. But not the cause. She needed the night before. The night that had changed everything. Victor had mentioned it himself, almost dismissively. One night, nothing that stood out. Daniel simply woke up different. Men like Victor Kane believed what they needed to believe. That was, she was learning, both his greatest strength and his most dangerous blind spot. She had access to the security archive through the same system that had delivered the nanny files, a local network terminal in her guest room, granted by Victor under the assumption that she would use it only for the approved footage. She'd used it for that. And then, at 2 a.m., with the penthouse quiet and her mind running fast, she'd used it for something else. The restricted archive required a secondary code she didn't have, so she found another way in. She'd worked briefly, very briefly, one difficult year she preferred not to revisit, as a consultant for a federal task force specializing in child welfare cases within organized crime environments. She'd sat in rooms with people who knew exactly how private security networks were structured, what their weaknesses were, where the unlocked doors tended to be. She hadn't planned to use any of that knowledge here. She used it now. It took her 40 minutes to find a back channel through an unpatched access node in the household staff scheduling system, the kind of mundane administrative software that nobody ever thought to properly secure because nobody ever imagined it mattered. It took another 20 to navigate from there to the restricted archive without triggering a visible log entry. What she found inside the archive looked, at first, like nothing. Most of the footage from that specific night, 8 months ago, the last night Daniel had been himself, was gone. Not corrupted, not damaged, deleted. Clean, deliberate, professional deletion, the kind that left no error messages and no thumbnail ghosts. Someone who knew what they were doing had removed the majority of the night's recordings. What remained were the fragments they'd missed, 3 cameras out of a system of 47. An exterior side entrance, angled slightly wrong. It caught the edge of a rarely used service door rather than its intended coverage area of the garden. A basement corridor, a camera that fed into a secondary monitor nobody checked because it had displayed a dead angle for 2 years after a pillar was installed in front of it. And an interior staircase camera, positioned high and wide, capturing the full sweep of the main stairs from the 3rd floor down to the entrance level. The deletion had been thorough, but nobody had thought to check the cameras that weren't supposed to show anything useful. She found the entry on the side door footage first, 11:43 p.m. The timestamp burned into the lower right corner of the frame. The image was grainy. This camera hadn't been updated with the rest of the system's upgrade 2 years ago, but it was clear enough. 3 men entering through the service door in single file. Moving quickly, purposefully, without the randomness of people arriving casually. The first man was broad and familiar, his build unmistakable even on a degraded camera at 11:43 in the night. Marcus Hale. Behind him, 2 others she didn't immediately recognize, but she noted the time and moved on. The basement corridor footage showed them again 7 minutes later, 11:50 p.m., moving deeper into the building, not toward the residential floors, but toward the lower level, the sub-basement. Victor had mentioned it obliquely during their first conversation. Storage, mechanical systems, a secure room for particularly sensitive discussions. He hadn't elaborated, and she hadn't pushed. She understood now why he kept it separate from the main conversation about the penthouse. The basement corridor camera lost them at the edge of its frame. They went through a door on the left side and didn't appear again on that camera. For 11 minutes, she had nothing. Then the staircase camera, 12:04 a.m., 21 minutes after they'd entered. The staircase footage was the best quality of the 3, newer camera, better angle, covering the full central staircase of the penthouse from a 3rd floor mounting position. It was designed to monitor movement between floors, flag unauthorized access to the upper residential levels after midnight. What it had captured instead, by pure accident of geometry and timing, was this. Marcus Hale and one of the other men crossing the entrance level at the bottom of the staircase, moving fast. Marcus had something in his right hand, dark, angular, unmistakable in shape even on camera, even in the low midnight lighting of the entrance hall. The footage lasted 9 seconds before they moved out of frame. 9 seconds. But Sophia watched those 9 seconds 4 times. Because it wasn't Marcus that made her throat close and her hand tighten on the edge of the desk. It was the staircase. Specifically, the 3rd floor landing, looking down. There, in the upper left quadrant of the frame, barely visible at the extreme edge of the camera's wide angle, half hidden by the banister rails, a small figure. Dark blue pajamas, hair unbrushed from sleep, standing completely still on the landing with both hands wrapped around the banister, looking directly down at the entrance hall below. Daniel. He couldn't have been there more than a few seconds before or after. The camera caught him only within that 9-second window, and in all 9 seconds, he didn't move. He simply stood and watched. A 7-year-old boy in pajamas, witnessing something at the bottom of the stairs that the camera's angle couldn't show, but that his drawings had already told her about. And then, in the final 2 seconds of the clip, before the footage cut to static, Daniel looked up. Not at Marcus, not at the door, directly at the camera, as if he'd always known it was there, as if he'd understood even then that someone might eventually come looking. Sophia closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a long time, completely still, the hum of the penthouse around her, and Daniel's latest drawing on the desk beside the closed laptop. Marcus, the black car, the gun, and she understood now that this child had not been breaking down for 8 months. He had been waiting for someone to find exactly what she'd just found. The question that moved through her now, cold and specific, was the same one that changed the entire shape of everything. What happened in the sub-basement that night? And the question behind that one, quieter and more dangerous, did Victor Kane order it? Sophia asked Victor at breakfast. She'd spent the previous night not sleeping, cycling between what the footage had shown her and the question she couldn't yet answer. She'd made no new notes in the hidden margin shorthand. Some things were too dangerous even for personal code. Instead, she'd sat at the desk until 4 a.m., organizing what she knew into what was certain and what was still shadow. Certain. Marcus Hale had entered the penthouse through a service entrance at near midnight, 8 months ago, with 2 unidentified men and a weapon. Certain. Daniel had witnessed something from the 3rd-floor landing. Certain. The majority of that night's security footage had been deliberately erased by someone with deep access to Victor's system. Shadow. What happened in the sub-basement? Shadow. Whether Victor had authorized any of it. Shadow. How much danger Daniel was in right now, inside these walls, surrounded by the same men he'd been trying to identify for 8 months through the only language available to a terrified 7-year-old. She needed Daniel out of the penthouse, even briefly, even just to breathe air that didn't pass first through Marcus Hale's security perimeter. She framed it clinically, the way she'd learned to frame everything in this environment. Controlled external exposure. Neutral territory. Children with acute stress responses often showed measurable improvement in communication when removed from the primary anxiety environment. She had data to support this. Real data. Published. She could send Victor the papers if he wanted them. Victor looked at her across the breakfast table for a long moment. He was already dressed at 7 a.m., which she suspected was always true. She doubted this man owned sleepwear. He drank his coffee black, ate nothing, and considered her request with the focused attention he brought to everything, which was both reassuring and slightly unnerving. 4 guards, he said finally. 2, Sophia countered. Plain clothes. Close, but not visible to Daniel. The moment he sees obvious security, the session is compromised. Another pause. 3. 2 close, 1 on perimeter. That works. He nodded once, which she was learning was his version of signing a document. They left at 10 a.m. through the building's private garage, an exit Sophia had specifically requested, wanting to avoid the main lobby where morning staff rotations brought Marcus's people through on a predictable schedule. She hadn't explained this preference to Victor. She'd said the rear exit was less stimulating for Daniel, fewer faces, quieter transition, which was also true. Daniel came without resistance, which surprised the housekeeper who had been bracing for a scene, and instead found herself watching a 7-year-old boy put on his jacket with quiet cooperation, as though he'd understood the plan before it was offered. He didn't take anyone's hand in the elevator, but he stood close to Sophia, close enough that his shoulder touched her arm, and that, she knew, was enormous. The drive to Central Park took 14 minutes. Daniel sat in the middle of the back seat, Sophia on his left, a plainclothes guard named Walsh on his right, who had been carefully briefed to look at his phone and pretend Daniel didn't exist. This instruction had visibly confused Walsh. He followed it anyway. Daniel watched the city through the window the entire drive, not with a child's passing distraction, not bouncing from building to taxi to street vendor with the loose attention of a boy on an outing. He watched with the same careful focus he brought to his drawings, eyes moving methodically, cataloging. She caught him twice looking at parked cars specifically. Both times his gaze moved to the license plates. She filed this away and said nothing. The park opened the city up in a way Manhattan usually refused to allow. Sky appeared, real sky, wide and pale gray with the particular quality of April light that couldn't decide between winter and spring. Daniel stopped on the path just inside the entrance and looked up at it. He stood there for almost a full minute. Sophia stood beside him and looked up too. She didn't speak. Walsh and the second guard, a woman named Carla who wore a running jacket and carried her radio and a hydration pack, spread naturally to either side without crowding them. Then Daniel started walking. She followed his lead entirely. This was critical, letting him set the pace and direction, giving him the experience of choosing his own path, possibly for the first time in 8 months. He moved deeper into the park, toward the open lawn areas south of the reservoir, where the trees thinned and you could see across wide stretches of grass without obstruction. For 20 minutes, something close to peace happened. Daniel didn't draw, didn't speak, but his shoulders dropped, literally, physically descended from the tense position she'd grown used to seeing, somewhere around his ears, and his stride lengthened. He looked at a dog chasing a ball. He stopped at the edge of the path to examine something in the grass that turned out to be a bottle cap. He held it for a while and then set it down carefully, exactly where he'd found it. Sophia felt something loosen in her own chest. Then she heard it, the specific sound of a heavy engine idling, nearby but not moving. The idle of something large and well-maintained, the kind of idle that belonged to... Daniel stopped. He stopped so suddenly that she nearly walked into him. He was standing at the edge of the path where it curved around toward the east side of the park, looking at the service road that ran parallel to the park boundary. A black SUV was parked along the road, dark windows, roof antenna, rear spoiler. Sophia looked at the car. She looked at Daniel. His whole body had changed. The dropped shoulders were back up, higher than before. His hands, which had been loose at his sides for the last 20 minutes, had closed into fists. His breathing was audible now, short and quick, the breath of someone whose body had just received a message from somewhere older and more honest than conscious thought. She crouched beside him. Not the performative crouch, not the adult trying to seem small squat. She simply lowered herself to his level naturally, unhurriedly, so he could see her face without tilting his head. "I'm right here," she said quietly. Daniel didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the black SUV. His right hand came up slowly, not pointing, more reaching, the gesture of someone trying to make sure something real was actually there. And his fingers found her sleeve and gripped it. She didn't move. She let him hold on. The SUV sat motionless on the service road. 30 seconds passed. A minute. It was probably nothing. City vehicle, parks department, private hire. Probably nothing. Then Daniel turned his face toward her. His eyes were dry. That was the thing that hit her hardest. No tears, no panic in the childish, overwhelming sense. His expression was the expression of someone communicating something urgent across a gap they weren't sure could be bridged. His mouth opened. The word came out barely above a breath, hoarse with 8 months of disuse, rough-edged and careful and absolutely clear. Bad. One word. His first. Sophia held very still, her sleeve still in his grip, and kept her voice completely steady even though her heart was doing something complicated behind her ribs. "I know," she said softly. "I believe you." Something in Daniel's face shifted. Not relief exactly, something older than relief and harder to name. The expression of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time and has just felt the first set of hands reach out to take part of it. He didn't let go of her sleeve for the entire walk back to the car. and Sophia understood with complete certainty, feeling the small, fierce grip of his fingers against her arm, that whatever had happened in that sub-basement 8 months ago, whatever Daniel had seen from the third-floor landing in his dark blue pajamas, it had not been nothing. It had been the kind of thing that silences a child for 8 months. The kind of thing that didn't stay buried forever. The kind of thing that was about to surface. She made the decision at 6 a.m., standing at the penthouse window with a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk, watching the city come alive below. She couldn't keep her notes here anymore. It wasn't paranoia. Paranoia was fear without evidence, and she had plenty of evidence. 3 days of documented observations in a personal shorthand that would take someone unfamiliar with it a while to decode, but not forever. Not if the person looking was trained, patient, and motivated. Not if the person looking was Marcus Hale, who had survived 11 years inside Victor Kane's organization by being exactly those 3 things. The previous evening, returning from Central Park, she'd noticed something that had kept her awake through most of the night. Her guest room had the particular quality of a space that had been very carefully restored to exactly how she'd left it. Too careful, too exact, the way a room looks when someone has been inside and worked hard to leave no trace. The small things were precisely right. Her notebook at the same angle on the desk, her laptop closed to the same degree, her shoes placed with the same small asymmetry she always left them. Too precisely right. Someone had learned her room well enough to recreate it. That required either a photograph before entry or a very good memory. Either option told her the same thing. She was being monitored, and whoever was doing it was skilled enough to make it nearly invisible. Nearly. She packed the essential materials into her personal bag, both notebooks, the folded drawings Daniel had given her, and a USB drive she'd used to copy 3 of the recovered security archive fragments the night of her unauthorized access. She requested a car at 7 a.m., telling the housekeeper she had a clinical supervision appointment she'd forgotten to mention. This was true enough. She did have a supervisor, a retired colleague in the Upper West Side, whom she checked in with on complex cases. She simply didn't have an appointment today. She had something more important. Her apartment was a 40-minute drive in morning traffic, a 2-bedroom in a quiet building in Brooklyn that she'd kept throughout the live-in arrangement at the penthouse. Arriving there felt like surfacing after too long underwater. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd been compressing inside Victor's walls until she stepped through her own door and felt her lungs expand properly for the first time in days. She spread everything on the kitchen table, the notebooks, the drawings, the USB drive, and her personal laptop. She made real coffee, not the precise, expensive variety the penthouse produced, but her own brand, slightly too strong, which was how she'd drunk it since graduate school. She sat down and began organizing. The timeline first, then the connections, then what remained unknown. She was halfway through reconstructing the sequence of Daniel's drawings in chronological order when her hands stopped moving. She was looking at today's drawing. Daniel had produced it during their morning session, before her 7 a.m. departure. She'd almost missed the session entirely in her urgency to leave, but he'd been waiting in the therapy room when she arrived at 6:45, sitting on the floor, already drawing, as though he'd known she was coming and was working against a deadline only he could see. She'd sat with him for 15 minutes. He'd finished without looking up and left the drawing on the floor between them the way he always did, and she'd collected it with the others and left. Now, at her kitchen table, she looked at it properly for the first time. It was his most detailed work yet. The progression across 6 days had been remarkable, each drawing more precise, more confident, as though a dial was being slowly turned up, as though he was finding that the act of being believed gave his hand more surety. The first drawing had been a careful sketch. This one was almost a document. Marcus was there again, unmistakable now, rendered with enough specific detail that any person who knew him would recognize him. The scar on the right hand, the particular width of his shoulders, the heavy jacket. But this time Marcus was not alone, and he was not standing. He was positioned above a figure on the ground. The ground figure was drawn smaller. Not a child, the proportions were wrong for that, this was an adult, lying on its side, one arm extended. And from the standing Marcus, Daniel had drawn a single dark line running downward toward the prone figure. A gun. Fired or held and aimed. The drawing's angle made it ambiguous, but the meaning was not ambiguous. In the lower right corner of the page, barely an inch tall, was a third figure. Small, standing at what appeared to be the top of a staircase, rendered as a simple diagonal line with small horizontal marks, like the banisters she'd seen in the security footage. The small figure's arms were drawn straight down at its sides, its face a simple oval with no features. Daniel had drawn himself as a face without features. Because he'd watched something he couldn't explain, Sophia understood. He'd given himself no expression because he hadn't had the words for what he felt in that moment, and still didn't. The blank oval wasn't absence of emotion. It was the opposite. It was emotion so large and so incomprehensible to a 7-year-old that it simply had no face to wear. She pressed her fingers flat on the table and breathed slowly. Daniel had witnessed a killing. Not a fight, not a confrontation, not something that could be explained away as security work or authorized enforcement. A killing carried out by Marcus Hale and other men inside Victor Kane's own home on a night when, and this was the detail that changed the weight of everything, the majority of the security footage had subsequently been erased by someone with deep system access, someone who knew the cameras were recording, someone who needed to erase the evidence, but who hadn't known about the 3 cameras they'd missed, and hadn't known about the small boy on the staircase in his dark blue pajamas. She wrote the conclusion in plain language for the first time, no shorthand, no code, because some things needed to be stated clearly, even if only to yourself, even if you immediately folded the paper and put it somewhere safe. Daniel Kane witnessed a murder committed by Marcus Hale inside the penthouse sub-basement approximately 8 months ago. Marcus and his associates deleted the security footage. Daniel has been attempting to communicate this ever since through the only method available to him, behavioral response and drawing. He has not been having a psychological breakdown. He has been a witness without a language for what he saw, surrounded by the people responsible, in a building controlled by his father. She folded the paper once, then again, and placed it inside the lining pocket of her bag. Then she sat back and addressed the second question, the one that had been sitting at the edge of everything since the beginning, patient and unavoidable. Victor Kane. Did he know? The footage deletion required deep system access. In Victor's organization, that access belonged to a small number of people. Victor himself was one. Marcus was almost certainly another, given his role. But the scope of the deletion, 44 cameras cleared from a single night, that was either authorized at the highest level, or it was a significant covert operation conducted from inside by someone who knew the system intimately and trusted that Victor wouldn't look. 2 possibilities. One was worse than the other. If Victor had ordered what happened in the sub-basement, Daniel was not safe anywhere inside that organization. If Victor hadn't, if Marcus had acted without authorization, then Victor was a man being betrayed by his most trusted operative, and Daniel's silence had been protecting his father from a truth his own house was hiding from him. She looked at the drawing one more time, Marcus above the prone figure, Daniel on the staircase, watching. She packed everything back into her bag and called for the car. She had to go back, because Daniel couldn't leave yet, and she wasn't leaving without him. She felt it the moment she walked back in. The penthouse had a particular atmosphere she'd grown accustomed to over 6 days. Controlled, tense, but with a predictable rhythm to it, like a clock you've heard long enough that you stop noticing the ticking. What she walked into now was different. The rhythm had changed. Not loudly, not in any way she could have pointed to and named for someone else, but the guards in the main hall stood at slightly different angles than usual. The housekeeper who normally greeted her at the elevator didn't appear. The 2 staff members she passed in the corridor near the kitchen went quiet a half-second before she rounded the corner. the specific quiet of people who'd been talking about something they'd stopped wanting to be caught discussing. Someone had moved first. She just didn't know what move had been made. She went directly to check on Daniel. He was in his room, sitting on the floor with his pencils, and he looked up when she entered with the particular alertness he reserved for her now, not the scanning wariness he gave everyone else, but something more focused, more directed. She sat down on the floor near him without speaking, and he returned to his drawing, and for a few minutes the room held its own quiet inside the changed atmosphere of the rest of the building. Then Daniel stopped drawing. He looked up at the small air vent in the upper corner of the room, a standard ventilation fixture, painted over several times, nothing remarkable about it. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Sophia. She kept her face neutral. She gave a small, slow nod. He understood. He picked up his pencil and went back to drawing. She understood, too. The room was wired. She found the first tail at 11 a.m. He was good, she'd give him that. A young guard she'd seen in rotation but never spoken to, positioned at various points along her routine morning path through the penthouse in a way that would have looked entirely natural to anyone not specifically watching for it. But Sophia had spent a year in environments where being watched without appearing to notice you were being watched was a survival skill, and she catalogued him the way she'd been trained. 3 separate sightings, different locations, no legitimate operational reason for the overlap. She was being followed inside the building, which meant Marcus knew she'd gone to her apartment, and he was trying to determine what she'd done there. She altered nothing about her visible behavior. This was critical. Any change in routine, any attempt to lose the tail, would confirm to Marcus that she'd noticed, and that there was something worth noticing. She completed her morning as planned. She had a brief session with Daniel, ate lunch at the penthouse dining table with 2 staff members who spoke carefully about nothing, and spent the early afternoon writing entirely innocuous clinical notes in the main notebook, visible language, nothing coded, the kind of notes that would satisfy anyone reading over her shoulder. At 2 p.m., she requested a meeting with Victor. He kept her waiting 20 minutes, which he'd never done before. When she was shown into his private office, Marcus Hale was already there. He was standing to the left of Victor's desk, arms loose at his sides, expression professionally empty. Sophia had seen him in corridors and on camera footage and in Daniel's drawings. This was the first time she'd been in the same room with him since the hallway encounter on day 2, where she'd seen the scar. Up close, he was larger than she'd registered, not just physically. There was a quality of weight to him, a gravitational field of the kind that certain people generated, the kind that made a room rearrange itself around their presence. Victor had it too, but differently. Victor's was cold and precise, like pressure. Marcus's was warmer on the surface and, she suspected, significantly colder underneath. He looked at her with an expression of complete, courteous neutrality. "Dr. Reed," he said, "Victor tells me the sessions are going well." "Daniel is making progress," she said, matching his register exactly. She sat in the chair across from Victor's desk without being invited to, which she did deliberately. Victor noted it, but said nothing. "You wanted to see me," Victor said. Not a question. "I wanted to update you on Daniel's clinical development, and I have a recommendation about his environment that I'd like to discuss." Victor leaned back slightly. "Go ahead." She'd planned this conversation carefully during the drive back from Brooklyn. The goal was not to reveal what she knew. Not yet, not here, not in this room, with Marcus standing 6 feet away. The goal was to introduce enough truth to create motion, to make Victor begin to move in a direction that would eventually separate him from Marcus, long enough to have a real conversation. "Daniel's trauma response is environmentally triggered," she said, keeping her tone purely clinical. "I've reviewed the nanny footage extensively, and I can tell you with confidence that his reactions aren't generalized. They're specific. He doesn't respond to strangers, to women, to men in general, or to sudden stimuli in isolation." She paused. "His responses cluster around particular individuals in his immediate environment." The room was very quiet. What individuals? Victor asked. That's what I'm still mapping. I don't want to name anyone incorrectly. A false identification in an environment like this one could be damaging in ways I'm not equipped to manage. What I can tell you with certainty is that Daniel saw something specific, something real. He isn't reacting to imagined threats. He's reacting to a memory. She watched Victor's face. The stillness that moved through it was different from his usual control. There was something moving underneath it, something trying to get to the surface and being very deliberately held down. Marcus spoke before Victor could. Children often create narratives around anxiety, he said smoothly, especially when they lack the language to process emotional upheaval. The loss of his mother 2 years ago was processed before the behavioral shift began, Sophia said, turning to look at Marcus directly for the first time. The grief response and the current trauma response have different signatures. I can distinguish between them. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was professionally appropriate. They're not the same event. Silence. Victor looked between them, slowly, with the calculating attention of someone assembling a picture from pieces he didn't yet have names for. Are you telling me, Victor said carefully, that someone in this building frightened my son? I'm telling you, Daniel remembers something that happened here, something that changed him overnight. She held Victor's gaze. I think you should ask yourself what happened in this building 8 months ago that you might not know about. Not what you authorized, what you might not know about. The distinction landed. She watched it land, watched Victor's eyes change in a way that was almost imperceptible, a fractional narrowing, a reassessment happening in real time behind the controlled surface. Marcus shifted his weight. Almost nothing, barely a centimeter, but she caught it. Marcus has been with me for 11 years, Victor said. His voice was flat and careful. I trust him completely. I know you do, Sophia said. She stood, picking up her bag. I'm not questioning your judgment, Mr. Kane. I'm asking you to question the information you've been given. There's a difference. She looked at him steadily. Daniel trusts very few people. He's chosen to communicate with me. I don't think that's accidental. She left the office. In the corridor outside, walking at her normal pace, she counted her own heartbeats to keep her breathing even. 40 steps to the staircase, 23 to the next corridor. She turned toward Daniel's wing and kept moving. Behind her, through the closed office door, she could hear nothing. But she didn't need to hear it. She dropped a stone into the water. The ripples were already moving, invisible and inevitable, toward shores she couldn't yet see. That night, she checked the lock on her guest room door and placed her bag between the mattress and the bed frame. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Marcus's weight shift, that almost nothing, barely there movement, and what it meant when a man that controlled moved at all. It meant she'd gotten close enough to something that he could feel it, and that, she knew from the year she preferred not to revisit, was precisely the moment things tended to become dangerous. She didn't sleep, not because she was afraid. Fear was something she could manage, had managed before, had been trained to move through rather than freeze inside. She didn't sleep because she was thinking, and the thinking kept producing the same conclusion no matter how many directions she approached it from. Daniel was not safe here. The meeting with Victor had done what she'd intended, introduced doubt, created motion, began the slow work of separating a man from his blind faith in someone who didn't deserve it. But slow work required time, and what she'd seen in Marcus's fractional weight shift told her that time was the one resource she no longer had. Marcus knew she was close. Marcus was a man who had deleted 44 security cameras, organized an unauthorized killing inside his employer's home, and maintained the trust of one of the most dangerous men in New York for 11 years. He did not leave problems to develop at their own pace. He would move. The question was when. She made her decision at 4 a.m., lying on top of the bed in her clothes with her bag already packed beside her. She would take Daniel out. Not a therapy trip, not a controlled external exposure session with plainclothes guards. Out. Completely. To somewhere Victor's security footprint didn't reach, where she could contact the federal consultant she'd worked with years ago, who could reach people equipped to handle what she was now holding. She had the drawings. She had the copied security footage fragments on the USB drive. She had her own documented observations across 8 days. She had enough. The problem was the garage. The penthouse had 3 exits: the main lobby, which ran through a staffed front desk, and a guard rotation that reported directly to Marcus. The rear service entrance on the building's north side, which fed through a corridor covered by 4 cameras and a key-coded door. And the underground parking garage, accessible from inside the building through a staff elevator that required a key fob, one of which Sophia had quietly borrowed from the housekeeper's station 2 days ago and had not yet returned. The garage was the weakest point in the security architecture. She'd mapped it during the drive back from Central Park, committing the layout to memory the way she'd once been taught to map exits in unfamiliar environments. 2 cameras, both fixed angle, one covering the elevator bank and one covering the main vehicle exit ramp, a blind spot of approximately 40 feet between them, running along the building's eastern interior wall where the older parking infrastructure hadn't been updated with the new system. She planned to move through the blind spot to a secondary pedestrian exit that opened onto a side street rather than the building's main entrance. At 6 a.m., she went to get Daniel. He was awake. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed, dark jacket over his sweater, shoes already on, with his small backpack in his lap. He was holding a folded piece of paper in both hands, and when she opened his door, he looked up at her with an expression of total calm. She almost stopped in the doorway. He'd known. Somehow, in whatever way he'd been knowing things throughout these 8 days, reading the building's atmosphere the way she read behavioral patterns, processing information through senses and systems that adults had forgotten to use, he'd known she was coming and had gotten ready. She crossed to him, crouched to his eye level, and spoke in a quiet and even voice. "We're going to walk to the elevator together. We're going to the garage. I want you to hold my hand and stay very close to me and not make any sounds, okay?" Daniel nodded. He held out the folded paper. She took it without opening it, put it in her bag. He took her hand. The staff elevator opened into the garage at 6:19 a.m. without incident. Sophia stepped out first, Daniel behind her, her hands still in his grip. The garage was dim, the overhead fluorescents cycling through their slow morning warm-up, pools of yellow light separated by stretches of shadow. The smell of concrete and engine oil, the distant sound of the city filtering in from the ramp exit. She turned left immediately, away from the elevator camera's angle, moving along the eastern wall through the blind spot. Her footsteps were quiet. Daniel's were quieter. He moved with the careful, deliberate tread of a child who had spent 8 months learning to exist without being noticed. 30 feet to the pedestrian exit. 25. A figure stepped out from between 2 parked vehicles. Not fast, not dramatic. Marcus Hale simply appeared, the way very still things appear when they stop choosing to be invisible. He was dressed in his standard dark jacket, hands loose at his sides, and his expression was the one she'd seen in Victor's office, courteous, professional, completely empty. He looked at her, then at Daniel. "Dr. Reed," he said. "Early start." Sophia stopped. She kept Daniel behind her with her hand. "Marcus, I'm taking Daniel to an external appointment. Victor approved it yesterday." "Victor approved a lot of things." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "He didn't tell me about this one." "That's between Victor and me." "It was." Marcus took one step forward. "Then you walked into his office and said what you said. And now it's between you and me." The garage was very quiet. The city sound from the ramp seemed suddenly far away. "Let us past," Sophia said. She kept her voice level, kept her breathing controlled, kept her hand pressed gently against Daniel's arm behind her. Stay behind me. Stay still. Stay quiet. Marcus looked at Daniel with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not cruelty exactly, something more complicated and therefore worse. The expression of a man looking at a problem he'd had 8 months to solve and hadn't, and who had now run out of patience with his own restraint. "He saw too much," Marcus said simply. "Not an accusation, not a confession, just a statement of fact, the way you describe a structural problem in a building. That night, he wasn't supposed to be on the stairs. None of us knew he was there until it was done." He paused. "And then he started drawing." The words landed in the concrete air of the garage and settled there. "Who did you kill?" Sophia asked. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been respect. "A man named Carver, mid-level distributor who'd been feeding information to a federal task force for 4 months. He needed to be handled." A pause. "Victor didn't agree with my timeline, so I didn't tell him about it." "You ran an unauthorized execution inside his home." "I protected his organization." Marcus's voice was flat and certain. "Victor is careful. Too careful sometimes. Opportunities close while he deliberates." "And Daniel?" "Daniel was a complication I managed poorly." He reached into his jacket. The sound of the garage door behind Marcus opening was the loudest thing Sophia had ever heard. Victor Kane walked through it. He was alone. No Reeves, no guard rotation, no buffer of security between him and the scene in front of him. He was wearing what he'd been wearing last night, which meant he hadn't slept either. His face was a controlled surface with something volcanic moving underneath it. He looked at Marcus, then at Sophia, then at Daniel, still behind her, small and still, and watching his father with that same ancient, careful expression. "Marcus," Victor said. His voice carried nothing, not anger, not betrayal, not hurt. It had moved past all of those into something colder and more final, the voice of a man who had woken up at 4 a.m. with a stone Sophia had dropped still reverberating, and had spent the hour since pulling threads. Marcus turned slowly. For the first time in 8 days, Sophia watched something flicker across Marcus Hale's face that wasn't professional composure. It was the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the most dangerous thing in this garage is not in front of him. It's behind him. "Victor," Marcus said, "let me explain." "You'll explain everything," Victor said quietly. "All of it. Tonight." He looked at Sophia over Marcus's shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes moved briefly to Daniel, to his son, still holding Sophia's hand, watching from behind her. And something in them shifted. Something that looked, briefly and unexpectedly, like a man realizing the full weight of what he'd built, and what that weight had cost. "Take him to the car," he said to Sophia. "My car, the black one at the far end." He looked back at Marcus. "You and I are going to talk." The warehouse was Victor's. Of course it was. Men like Victor Kane didn't conduct difficult conversations in borrowed spaces. Every room where real things happened belonged to him, purchased, controlled, swept for interference twice before arrival. The building sat at the edge of the lower Manhattan waterfront, a converted industrial space that looked abandoned from the outside, and was, on the inside, exactly what it appeared to be: bare concrete, high ceilings, the smell of the river working through the walls. No furniture except 3 chairs in the center of an empty floor, arranged with the deliberate geometry of something planned in advance. Victor had been planning this for longer than tonight. Sophia understood that now. The way he'd appeared in the garage, alone, no security, moving like a man who had already made every decision that needed making, told her that the stone she'd dropped 2 days ago hadn't been the beginning. It had been the confirmation of something Victor had already begun to suspect, maybe longer ago than she knew. Maybe the doubt had always been there, quiet and managed, buried under 11 years of loyalty and operational success. She'd simply given it a name. She wasn't in the warehouse. Victor had been clear about that. Not unkind, not dismissive, just clear in the way he was clear about everything. She and Daniel were taken to a secure vehicle that drove them to a safe location, a private apartment in a building Victor apparently maintained for exactly these kinds of contingencies, staffed by 2 people Sophia had never seen before, which meant they were outside Marcus's sphere entirely. The apartment was clean, warm, and anonymous. There was food in the kitchen and a bedroom with a proper bed and a window that looked out over a quiet residential street. Daniel stood at the window for a long time, watching the street. Sophia sat at the small kitchen table with the folded piece of paper Daniel had handed her in his bedroom before they'd left, the one she hadn't yet opened. She opened it now. It was different from all the others. No Marcus, no black car, no gun, no staircase. The drawing was simpler than anything he'd produced in 8 days, almost primitive, a deliberate step back from the careful detail he'd been building toward, as though he'd decided that what he wanted to say this time didn't need complexity to carry it. 2 figures, side by side, one tall, one small. The tall figure's hand extended downward, and the small figure's hand extended upward, and they were connected, fingers meeting in the middle of the page in a simple, joined line. Underneath, in careful, labored block letters, the letters of a child who had recently and selectively chosen to stop speaking and had now decided, with equal selectivity, to write, were 4 words. You found the bad. Sophia set the drawing down on the table very carefully and pressed both hands flat beside it and breathed. In the warehouse, Victor sat across from Marcus Hale for the last time. He'd learned, over 30 years of building something most people couldn't look at directly, to read the difference between a man who was afraid of him and a man who respected him. Fear and respect wore similar expressions. The straight spine, the controlled face, the measured voice. But they came from different places and broke differently under pressure. He was watching Marcus break now. Not collapse. Marcus was not a collapsing man. He was breaking the way expensive things broke. Slowly, along clean lines, with a kind of structural dignity that made the breakage worse to watch, not better. Start at the beginning, Victor said. Not Carver. The beginning. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he started talking. It had begun 2 years ago, not with a single decision, but with an accumulation of small ones, the kind that felt, individually, like operational judgment calls, and only revealed their true shape when you laid them end to end and looked at the full length of what you'd built. Marcus had identified what he believed were critical vulnerabilities in Victor's organization: rival factions consolidating, federal monitoring intensifying, informants embedded more deeply than Victor's careful, deliberate approach could address in time. He'd gone to Victor twice. Both times, Victor had counseled patience, surveillance, legal leverage before physical resolution. Marcus had decided patience was a luxury they couldn't afford. He built a parallel structure inside Victor's organization. Small, 4 men, all trusted, all with sufficient operational independence that their movements didn't flag on any internal monitoring. They handled what Marcus had decided needed handling, on his timeline rather than Victor's, without authorization and without record. 6 operations over 14 months, 6 people eliminated. Rivals, informants, 1 man who had simply known too much about a transaction Marcus had conducted outside Victor's awareness. Each one handled cleanly, each one leaving no visible trace back to the organization. The 7th had been Carver. Carver was different, not because the operation had been messier, but because of where Marcus had chosen to conduct it. The sub-basement of the penthouse, Victor's home. Marcus justified it. Carver had become a security risk too acute to transport elsewhere. Time had compressed. The decision had been made in the penthouse because that was where they'd received the intelligence confirmation that night. What he hadn't accounted for was a 7-year-old boy who couldn't sleep. "You brought a body into my home," Victor said. His voice hadn't changed since the garage. It had stayed in that same cold, final register. A voice that had gone somewhere beyond anger and had found a landscape with no landmarks at all. "I protected your organization," Marcus said. The justification came automatically, the same words he'd been using inside his own head for 8 months, rehearsed, reinforced, worn smooth with repetition. "Everything I did was for my son." Victor leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, almost gently, the way you move toward something broken that you want to examine carefully. "Daniel watched you do it. He's been living inside this building for 8 months, watching the man who murdered someone in his home walk through his corridors every single day. He's 7 years old." Marcus said nothing. "He stopped speaking. Did you know that? He stopped speaking entirely for 8 months. Victor paused. "Because you needed to handle a scheduling problem, Marcus. It wasn't 6 operations." Victor's voice cut across his cleanly. 6 people dead without my knowledge or authorization. A parallel structure inside my organization that I didn't know existed. You weren't protecting what I built. You were building something of your own, inside mine, using my name and my resources and my reputation." The warehouse held the silence. Marcus looked at Victor steadily. Whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes was arriving at an answer he didn't look pleased with, but had apparently already accepted. The expression of a man who had followed the logic of his own choices to their end and was now standing at the edge of that end, looking at it clearly for the first time. "You would have been too slow," Marcus said. "Finally, underneath the justification, something true. You deliberate. You counsel patience. Meanwhile, things move, Victor. The world moves. People who mean to destroy what you've built don't wait while you consider the ethics of response. That's not your decision to make. Someone has to. Not you." Victor stood, which brought the conversation to a place from which there was no return. "Not in my house. Not around my son. Not without my knowledge." He looked at Marcus for a long moment. 11 years of partnership, 11 years of trust, looking at itself from the other side of what trust, misplaced, could become. "You decided you understood my organization better than I did. You decided your judgment superseded mine. You built a secret inside the thing I spent my life constructing." He paused. "And then a 7-year-old child paid for your decision every single day for 8 months. Alone. In a house full of people who were supposed to protect him." Marcus looked at the floor for the first time. It was, Sophia would think later when Victor told her what had happened, the only moment in the entire conversation where Marcus Hale looked like what he actually was. A man who had made choices he couldn't unmake, who had told himself they were necessary, until necessary had become a language he no longer noticed he was speaking. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. Victor looked at him. "You tell me everything," he said quietly. "Every operation, every name, every decision. Tonight." He sat back down. "And then we'll discuss what happens after." The river moved outside the warehouse walls. Somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment on a residential street, a small boy was standing at a window, watching the world outside with careful, patient eyes, waiting, as he had always been waiting, for the truth to find its feet. The safe house was nothing like the penthouse. That was the first thing Sophia noticed when Victor's car pulled through the private gate 3 days after the warehouse. 3 days during which she and Daniel had remained in the anonymous apartment while Victor handled what needed to be handled, in ways she didn't ask about and he didn't offer to explain. The safe house sat on 11 acres of private land in Westchester, low and wide, built from old stone and dark timber, surrounded by trees that had been growing longer than anyone currently alive had been making decisions. There were no visible guards. There were guards. She knew that without needing confirmation. But they were positioned in the tree line, in vehicles on the access road, in places where a 7-year-old boy walking outside would see only open grass and sky. Victor had chosen it himself. She understood that the moment she saw it. This wasn't a security decision. It was a father's decision. Imperfect, late, made from inside a life that had produced very few soft things. But real. He had looked at his son, or looked at what his son had endured, and had tried to answer it with the only language currently available to him: space, quiet, and the absence of walls. Daniel stepped out of the car and stood on the gravel path in front of the house. He looked at the trees. He looked at the grass. He looked at the sky, which was clear and new-washed, the particular blue of early spring that appears without warning and makes everything it touches look temporary and precious. He didn't say anything, but he breathed differently. She heard it, a single, slow breath, drawn in through the nose, held for a moment, released. The breath of someone who has been in a small room for a very long time and has just walked through a door into open air. The first week at the safe house settled into its own rhythm. Morning sessions with Sophia in a large room on the ground floor that faced east, filled with light by 9 o'clock. Afternoons that Daniel controlled, outside when he wanted, inside when he didn't, drawing when the need came, sitting in silence when it didn't. No schedule imposed beyond what was necessary. No staff rotation through his personal space. No Marcus Hale in the building, in the corridor, in the penthouse, in Daniel's world any longer. Victor was present more than Sophia had expected. He worked, the calls still came, the decisions still required making, the organization that had outlasted rivals and federal pressure and 14 months of internal betrayal did not pause for personal reckoning. But he worked from the safe house, and when he wasn't working, he was there. Not intrusively, not with the manufactured cheerfulness that parents sometimes deployed around damaged children, like a performance of normalcy. Victor Kane was not capable of that particular performance, and didn't attempt it. He simply sat in the same rooms as his son, read at the desk in the corner while Daniel drew on the floor, ate at the same table at the same hours, walked the property in the late afternoon with the specific, unhurried stride of a man who had nowhere else to be, and said nothing when Daniel sometimes followed at a distance of 10 feet, not quite walking with him, not quite apart. Sophia watched all of this and documented none of it. Some things didn't need to be recorded. They just needed to happen. She found the drawings on day 7. Daniel had left them on the kitchen table, not hidden, not tucked under a door in the night, left out deliberately, in daylight, in the center of the table where anyone would find them. 3 drawings, side by side. The first was the penthouse. She recognized the proportions, the high windows, the scale of the building rendered in a child's confident hand. Drawn entirely in gray pencil, every line, including the sky above it. The second was the warehouse scene she hadn't witnessed but appeared to have understood. 2 figures seated across from each other in a wide, empty space, one figure slightly larger, the other with a mark on its right hand. Between them, the air of the drawing was somehow charged. She couldn't have explained how a pencil sketch on white paper communicated atmosphere, but this one did. The conversation had weight in Daniel's rendering of it, even without words. The third drawing was the safe house, drawn in color, the only colored drawing he'd produced in 10 days. Green for the trees, blue for the sky, the warm brown of the stone walls. 3 figures outside, 2 adults, 1 child. The child in the center, hands extended to either side. The tall figure on the left connected at the hand. The second adult figure on the right also connected. Sophia looked at herself in the drawing. The right-hand figure, slightly shorter than Victor, hair down the way she wore it in the evenings when the professional day had ended. Daniel had given her a face, eyes, mouth, the suggestion of an expression. He'd drawn her smiling. She stood at the kitchen table for a long time. He spoke on day 9. not the single desperate word in Central Park, wrested from 8 months of silence by terror and the urgent need to communicate danger. This was different. A sentence, quiet and deliberate, offered freely on a Tuesday morning while Sophia was reading in the Eastern Room and Daniel was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his colored pencils. She almost missed it. He spoke without looking up from his drawing, in a voice roughened by disuse but entirely steady, as though he'd been running the words through his mind long enough that the speaking of them was simply the final step of something already completed. "They were lying," he said. Sophia lowered her book. She didn't speak immediately. She gave the sentence its space, let it exist in the room without rushing to respond to it, because she understood that this was not the beginning of a conversation. It was the end of one, the conclusion of an 8-month internal argument Daniel had been conducting entirely alone, that had begun on a staircase in the dark and had moved through 99 broken sessions and silent drawings and a word in a park and a drawing of joined hands, and had arrived here, finally, in a room full of morning light. "I know," she said. Daniel nodded, the way someone nods when they receive confirmation of something they were already certain of. He picked up a blue pencil and continued drawing. She watched him for a moment, the focused downward attention, the steady grip, the quiet that surrounded him now, which was entirely different from the quiet of 8 months of containment and fear. This was chosen quiet. This was peace in the way peace actually looked when it arrived. Not dramatic, not tearful, not the orchestrated resolution of something terrible finally ended. Just a boy drawing at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in a room with good light. "Daniel," she said. He looked up. "You did well," she told him. "For a very long time. You kept trying until someone listened." Daniel considered this. His expression moved through something she didn't try to name. Too many things at once, too layered and too honest for a single word to hold. Then he looked back at his drawing. "You listened," he said simply. Victor heard about it that afternoon. He was in the small office off the main corridor, on a call that he ended mid-sentence when Sophia appeared in the doorway. She told him briefly, without embellishment, what Daniel had said and when. She watched his face while she spoke. He was a man who had survived 30 years of an empire built on controlled surface, who had learned before he was 30 that emotion was a resource like any other, to be managed and deployed strategically, never simply felt. She had seen his face remain composed through conversations that would have shattered most people. She watched it not remain composed now. It happened slowly, the way things that have been held very tightly loosen when the holding finally costs more than the release. His jaw shifted. Something behind his eyes moved. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, past her, past the room, at something private and irretrievable. "2 words," he said finally. "2 sentences," Sophia said. "I think there are more coming." Victor nodded. He looked at his hands on the desk, the hands of a man who had built and broken and controlled, that had never quite managed to simply hold the thing that needed holding most. "I should have looked harder," he said, not to her, to himself, or to whoever exists inside the moments when we finally stop managing our own reckoning and let it arrive. 8 months. He was trying to tell me for 8 months. He was trying to tell whoever would listen, Sophia said. "You're listening now." Victor looked at her. His expression was open in a way she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Whatever this is. The part after." "Nobody does," Sophia told him. "You do it anyway." She stayed. Not indefinitely. She was clear about that, with herself and eventually with Victor. She wasn't a permanent fixture, not a replacement for the work of rebuilding that Daniel would need over months and years, with professionals and time and the slow accumulation of safe experiences layered over the ones that had taken so much from him. but she stayed, for now. Long enough for the sessions to deepen, for Daniel's voice to grow more frequent and less careful, for the drawings to shift, gradually, almost imperceptibly, from documentation of what he'd witnessed toward something more expansive. Animals appeared. Trees, abstract shapes and colors he chose apparently at random for the pleasure of the choosing. One morning he drew something that had no fear in it at all. A wide open landscape, hills and sky, and a road running toward the horizon, and on the road, 3 small figures walking. She kept that one. She didn't analyze it. Some things, she had learned, didn't need decoding. They just needed to be. The city moved on the way cities do, without pausing, without acknowledging what had shifted within it. Somewhere in Manhattan, in a penthouse that was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something smaller and less fortified, a room that had once been filled with the drawings of a frightened boy sat empty and clean, waiting to become something else. Marcus Hale was gone. The how of that belonged to Victor, to that night in the warehouse, to the conversation that had run until 3 a.m. and had ended in the particular way that certain things inside Victor's world ended. The men Marcus had operated with were gone too, quietly, efficiently, without public record. The federal consultant Sophia had once worked with received, through an anonymous channel, a detailed account of 6 unauthorized operations and the names attached to them. She didn't ask Victor how that had happened. He didn't explain. Some doors, she had learned, could be opened without choosing to walk all the way through them. On the last Thursday of the month, Sophia arrived at the safe house for a session to find Daniel already outside, sitting in the grass at the edge of the tree line with a sketchbook in his lap and the afternoon light coming through the leaves above him in shifting patterns. He heard her approach and looked up. "I drew you again," he said. She sat down in the grass beside him. "Can I see?" He showed her. This time she wasn't the right-hand figure, slightly apart. She was in the center. And that, she decided, was exactly enough.